There is a certain kind of healing that cannot be measured by medicine alone. It is the healing that occurs when fragments of the self, scattered across years of pain, forgotten memories, and denied truths, begin to weave themselves back into wholeness. This is what I mean by integration, the process of reclaiming all that you are, both light and shadow, and allowing those parts to coexist in harmony. When we are broken, we often look outside for cures. But true transformation arises when what has been split apart within us begins to rejoin. Healing is not the absence of struggle, but the quiet recognition that we are becoming more complete, more authentic, more ourselves. Today, I want to share with you 5 clear signs that you are healing through integration. You may recognize yourself in some of these, or perhaps in all. They are markers on a long journey, a journey toward wholeness. There comes a moment in every human life when the inner battle grows unbearable. We are taught from childhood to repress the feelings that disturb others, to hide away the parts of ourselves that seem too heavy, too wild, too dangerous. We lock them away in secret rooms within the psyche, telling ourselves that if we bury them deeply enough, they will trouble us no more. But the truth is that nothing buried is ever gone. It lingers beneath the surface, shaping our choices, haunting our nights, and coloring the way we see the world. To live only in the light is to live half a life. The shadows remain, whether we acknowledge them or not. They wait patiently, whispering through dreams, leaking out in moments of rage or despair, reminding us that what has been denied cannot be destroyed. And so, one of the clearest signs that you are healing through integration is when you begin to turn toward these shadows without fear. When the anger you once feared, the grief you once buried, the jealousy you despised, and the fear you ran from are no longer enemies, but companions whose voices you are willing to hear. Think for a moment about anger. Many of us are taught that anger is shameful, destructive, or dangerous, so we silence it, we swallow it, we smile when we mean stop, we nod when we want to shout, and for a time this seems safe, but repression has a cost. What is silenced within does not vanish, it grows toxic, turning inward into depression or outward into explosive violence. Psychologists have long observed this, that what the mind refuses to feel will often make itself known through the body, through tension, illness, or exhaustion. But healing begins when we approach anger differently. Imagine the person who has always said yes, even when their heart cried no. They are praised for being agreeable, for being selfless, for never making trouble. And yet, inside, resentment brews. Then one day, after much inner work, they discover the courage to speak with clarity. No, I cannot do this. No, I will not betray myself. That single word, once terrifying, now becomes a boundary. And in that moment, anger ceases to be destructive. It becomes a guardian. What was once buried now protects life. This is integration. The same is true of grief. In our culture, grief is often hurried along, hidden behind closed doors. People tell the grieving to stay strong or move on, as though sorrow is an embarrassment. But grief ignored does not disappear, it crystallizes in the heart, hardening into numbness. I once knew a woman who lost her child, and for years she pretended to be untouched, telling everyone she was fine. Only when she finally allowed herself to weep, to rage at the heavens, to collapse into the arms of others, did she begin to live again. By making space for grief, she discovered that sorrow was not her enemy. It was love in another form. Integration allowed her to see that grief does not need to be feared. It is the proof that we have loved deeply, and love, even in its most painful form, belongs. Jealousy, too, is often despised. We label it petty, childish, unworthy of us. But jealousy, when examined honestly, can reveal where our deepest desires lie. The artist who feels jealousy toward another's success is not merely small-minded. They are being shown their own longing to create, to be seen, to give their gift to the world. If they suppress that jealousy, it festers into bitterness. But if they listen to it, they can discover the direction of their own growth. Integration allows jealousy to transform into inspiration, showing us what we secretly yearn for but have not yet dared to claim. And what of fear? Fear has many disguises: hesitation, procrastination, avoidance. Most of us fight against it or pretend it does not exist. But fear, when welcomed, often has wisdom hidden within it. It tells us where the edges of our comfort lie, where we are being called to grow. A man who fears intimacy may discover, if he dares to sit with that fear, that what he longs for most is genuine connection. Fear, then, becomes not a wall but a doorway, pointing toward the very thing his soul desires. Integration does not mean indulging every impulse or surrendering to every shadow. It does not mean living in constant rage, drowning in grief, or chasing every jealous thought. Integration means recognition. It means giving these voices a seat at the table of the self, not as dictators but as advisors. Anger says, here is where you need protection. Grief says, here is where you have loved. Jealousy says, here is what you long for. Fear says, here is where you must grow. When we stop exiling these parts, they cease to sabotage us from the dark. They join us, and in doing so, they become transformed. You know you are healing when you can stand before the mirror of your own soul and see not only the face you present to the world, but also the shadow behind it, and you do not turn away. Instead, you nod in recognition. You say, yes, you too are me. This recognition creates a profound shift. You are no longer divided against yourself. You are no longer running from what has always been within you. And with this acceptance comes a new strength, because wholeness is power. Consider how a tree grows. The branches reach toward the sky, toward the light, but the roots dig just as deeply into the dark earth. If the roots were to fear the darkness, if they refused to descend into the soil, the tree would wither. Growth requires both directions, upward into the light and downward into the shadow. So it is with us. To fear the shadow is to deny the very foundation of our strength, but to embrace it is to allow ourselves to grow tall, balanced, and whole. When you begin to welcome your shadows, you may notice something unexpected: peace. Not the peace of a life without storms, but the peace of no longer fighting against yourself. Imagine the relief of no longer wearing masks, no longer pretending to be only what others approve of. Imagine the freedom of being able to say, I am angry, or I am afraid, or I am grieving, without shame. This honesty opens the door to authenticity, and authenticity is the ground of all healing relationships, with ourselves, with others, and with life itself. The journey is not easy. The shadows resist at first. They frighten us with their intensity, their unfamiliar voices, but with patience, courage, and compassion, we discover that they are not demons to be destroyed, but exiled children longing to come home. And when they return, the house of the self grows larger, more alive, more whole. So if you notice that you are no longer afraid to face the parts of yourself you once rejected, if you find yourself listening to anger without violence, weeping without shame, learning from jealousy, walking with fear, then know this: you are healing. Integration has begun its sacred work within you, and in that work lies the promise not of perfection, but of wholeness. which is the deepest form of freedom any of us can hope to find. There is a quiet moment in healing that does not always announce itself with fireworks or great revelations, but rather with a subtle shift that feels both unfamiliar and deeply comforting. It is the moment when you notice that you are no longer splitting yourself into fragments, no longer scattering pieces of your being into different disguises to meet the expectations of others. Integration brings with it this quiet sense of alignment, and you may feel it as a kind of inner coherence, as though the warring voices inside have grown tired of their battle and agreed at last to speak in harmony. For much of life, many of us lie divided. We play roles so seamlessly that we forget they are costumes. At work, we put on the mask of competence, even when inside we feel uncertain. At home, we may wear the mask of calm, though our hearts carry storms. With friends, we laugh and perform ease, while in solitude we collapse under the weight of silence. This division, though common, extracts a heavy toll. To live as several different selves is exhausting, for the psyche strains to keep all the masks from falling. And yet, we convince ourselves it is necessary. We believe that if people saw what we really carried, if they glimpsed the despair beneath the cheer, the uncertainty behind the authority, they would turn away. So we maintain the split, unaware of how much life it drains from us. Integration, however, gradually dissolves these contradictions. It does not happen overnight, and it does not erase every struggle. But it begins with a recognition that the cost of living in fragments is too high, and the only way forward is to gather the pieces back into one. I once knew a woman who lived for years in this split. To her colleagues, she was the capable professional, the woman who never faltered, who carried endless energy and strength. At home, she wore another face, quiet, composed, hiding her deep sadness even from those closest to her. Alone, she carried a different reality altogether, loneliness, despair, and the sense that her life was only a performance. When she began her journey of integration, she feared that allowing her true emotions to surface would ruin everything. She thought her world would collapse if she stopped pretending, yet what actually collapsed was the distance between herselves. As she slowly dared to show her sadness to her family, her vulnerability to her friends, and even her uncertainty at work, she found something astonishing. She was still loved. Her life became one life, no longer two, no longer three. She described it to me once in a simple sentence that carried the weight of her transformation. For years I lived two lives, the one people saw and the one I hid. Now they are the same life. This is the essence of coherence. It is not the attainment of perfection, but the profound relief of no longer fighting yourself. The war inside quiets, and though difficulties remain, you face them as one person rather than as a divided army. Psychologists speak of this state as self, congruence, when your values, choices, and identity move in the same direction, when you are no longer dragged apart by inner contradiction. You feel it in small ways at first. The courage to say no when once you would have yielded, the honesty to admit sadness instead of smiling it away, the steadiness of knowing that who you are in public is not a fabrication but a continuation of who you are in private. Imagine a river formed by many streams. Before integration, these streams may rush in different directions, some hidden underground, others flowing wildly, never meeting. Life feels scattered, incoherent, impossible to control. But through healing, the streams find their way toward one another, merging into one river that flows forward with power and clarity. That river does not lose the individuality of its streams, but it unites them in a single direction. So it is with us. The parts of ourselves that once felt irreconcilable the strong and the vulnerable, the joyful and the grieving, the confident and the fearful, find their meeting place, they flow together, and in that unity there is strength. When coherence begins to grow within, it shows itself in the smallest of daily acts. You may notice you no longer have to think so carefully about which version of yourself to present in a given situation. You may catch yourself speaking more honestly than you used to, without calculating how it will be received. You may realize that you are not as easily shaken by the judgments of others, because your sense of self is not split into fragile compartments. The relief of this is immense. It is as though the constant background noise of inner conflict has at last been silenced, leaving you with an energy you did not know you had lost. There is also a profound psychological and even physical effect when coherence emerges. Research has shown that the strain of living in contradiction, saying one thing but feeling another, presenting oneself while hiding the true one, creates stress that seeps into the body. Anxiety, insomnia, even chronic illness often follow from the relentless effort of keeping the masks in place. But when the masks drop, when the self aligns, the body too finds relief, breath deepens, shoulders loosen, sleep returns. What the psyche resolves, the body mirrors, and beyond the individual, inner coherence changes the fabric of our relationships. When you are divided, others sense the dissonance. They may not know its source, but they feel its tension. People are drawn to wholeness because it radiates authenticity. When you begin to live as oneself, without hiding and without pretense, your connections grow stronger, more real. You no longer relate through performance, but through presence. You may even notice that others relax in your company, for coherence has a ripple effect. It gives silent permission for others to step out of their own masks. Yet coherence does not mean a life free from conflict or struggle. The integrated person still feels anger, still knows fear, still encounters doubt. But the difference is that these experiences do not tear them apart. They flow within the same river, adding depth without division. The integrated person is not flawless, but whole. They live a single life, and that life, though imperfect, carries the beauty of truth. So when you begin to feel this inner coherence, when you no longer need to switch between roles so drastically, when you notice that the many streams of your being are flowing together, recognize it for what it is, a sign that you are healing. The work of integration is subtle, yet its fruits are unmistakable. You begin to inhabit yourself fully, and for perhaps the first time, you feel the deep and quiet strength of being truly at home within your own skin. There is a quiet turning point in the journey of healing, a sign so subtle at first that you may hardly notice it, yet so profound that it marks a deep transformation of the soul. It is the moment when the triggers that once ruled you begin to loosen their hold. The sharp sting of old wounds, the reflexive surge of anger, fear, or despair, no longer throws you into chaos as it once did. The very same situations that once swept you away like a storm may now stir only a ripple across the surface of your being. You still feel, but you are not consumed. That difference, though invisible to the outside world, signals a vast change within. To understand this, we must first recognize how powerfully the past lives in us. Every insult, every rejection, every abandonment leaves its trace in the psyche. These experiences are not stored as lifeless facts. They are etched into the nervous system, ready to flare up when anything resembles the original wound. This is why the child who grew up under constant criticism may, as an adult, feel an almost unbearable panic when a colleague questions their work. It is not only the present moment they are reacting to, it is the echo of childhood shame flooding through them again and again. These triggers hold us captive, for they bind us to the past. We are no longer responding to life as it is, but to life as it once was, repeating endlessly in the theater of memory. Yet integration begins to unravel this cycle. Healing does not mean the memories vanish, nor that the feelings they once carried are erased. Rather, it means that the charge they once held begins to weaken. Like a wound that forms scar tissue, the rawness of the memory softens. Where once there was open pain, there is now resilience. Where once a word of criticism might have shattered the self, now it may cause a fleeting sting, followed by understanding. A person who once dissolved into panic when faced with judgment may pause, breathe, and recognize, "This is about them, not all of me." That recognition is a miracle in its quietness, for it reveals the presence of a self no longer shackled to the past. This is not only poetic truth, it is also biological. Neuroscience has shown that when we reprocess painful memories with awareness and compassion, the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, begins to calm. The pathways of fear grow weaker, while new pathways of regulation strengthen. It is as though the inner watchman, once always on guard, finally learns that the danger has passed. The memory remains, but the terror attached to it dissolves. Integration, then, is not about erasing what has been. It is about loosening the chains so we can walk forward unbound. Imagine someone who carries a history of betrayal. For years, any hint of dishonesty in a partner sends them spiraling into rage and despair. They accuse, they cling, they lash out, for the wound of betrayal is still raw, replaying itself through each new relationship. But over time, as they confront and integrate the original pain, something shifts. They may still notice the sting of suspicion, but instead of erupting, they can step back, breathe, and choose a response. They may even say calmly, "This hurts because I have known betrayal before, but I want to understand what is happening here." The past is still present, but it no longer dictates the future. That is integration, that is freedom. This freedom is often experienced as space between stimulus and response, space between the moment something strikes us and the moment we act. Before healing, that space is non-existent. We are swept away before we even know what has happened. But as integration deepens, the space widens. We find ourselves able to pause, to reflect, to decide. And within that pause lies our liberation. The old triggers may still arise, but they no longer command obedience. We are free to choose differently. It is important to acknowledge that this loosening does not mean indifference. To feel less consumed by old triggers is not to become numb. On the contrary, it is to feel more fully but without collapse. The person who once drowned in rage now feels anger rise and fall like a wave, powerful yet passing. The one who once sank in despair now feels sadness without losing their ground. This is the paradox of integration. We do not feel less, we feel more truly. Emotions no longer possess us, but neither are they denied. They move through us as they were meant to, carrying their message without imprisoning the soul. You may notice this shift in ordinary life. Where once a harsh word from a loved one would have led to days of silent resentment, now it may cause a moment of pain, followed by dialogue and repair. Where once a mistake at work would have spiraled into self-loathing, now it becomes a lesson, something to correct without collapsing into shame. These moments may seem small, but they mark the arrival of a new self, one that is no longer living in the grip of old wounds. The image that comes to mind is that of chains rusting and breaking apart. For years, perhaps decades, you have carried them without question. They have bound your reactions, pulled you back into the same stories, the same fears, the same griefs. And then, through the slow, difficult work of integration, you notice one day that the chains are lighter, that some have fallen away altogether. You can move more freely. You can breathe more deeply. The past is still part of you, but it no longer defines you. This is one of the most hopeful signs of healing, because it is often the first that others can see as well. Friends and family may remark that you seem calmer, less reactive, more at ease. They may notice that situations which once left you shattered now leave you steady. What they are witnessing is the birth of coherence from chaos, the quiet flowering of integration. And so, when you find that the old wounds no longer hold you captive, when the same circumstances that once overwhelmed you now leave only a ripple, recognize the significance of this shift. It means that the chains are breaking. It means that your past no longer dictates your present. It means that you are walking forward not as a prisoner, but as one who is free. There is a moment in the work of integration when the sharp edges you once turned against yourself begin to soften, and instead of meeting your own reflection with judgment, you begin to meet it with tenderness. For so long you may have treated yourself as a problem to be solved, as if your worth depended on erasing every flaw, correcting every mistake, living up to every impossible standard. You carried the weight of your own condemnation, believing that only through relentless criticism could you keep yourself in line, as though love were a reward for perfection. But this inner war drains the soul. It silences joy, it poisons creativity, and it keeps you forever at a distance from yourself. To live under the gaze of such unforgiving eyes is to live in exile from the very home of your being. And yet, as integration deepens, something remarkable begins to stir within. That harsh inner voice, once so loud, grows quieter. It does not vanish all at once, but it loses its authority. In its place arises another voice, quieter, gentler, but infinitely wiser. It is the voice that says, "You are human. You are allowed to falter. You are worthy not because you are flawless, but because you exist." In this shift lies the seed of compassion, and the soil in which it grows is self-acceptance. When you stop treating yourself like an enemy to be defeated, and instead begin to regard yourself as a child to be cared for, your inner world changes. What once was harsh becomes soft. What once was battle becomes sanctuary. This transformation does not mean ignoring responsibility or refusing to see your faults. On the contrary, it allows you to face them more honestly because you are no longer crushed by shame. To approach your flaws with compassion is not to excuse them, but to hold them in the larger context of your humanity. When a child stumbles while learning to walk, we do not berate them, we extend our hand and encourage them to rise again. In the same way, compassion teaches us to view our own stumbles as part of growth. Integration is the recognition that your wounds are not proof of weakness, but pathways toward wholeness. I recall the story of a man who lived under the heavy shadow of shame for many years. His failures haunted him like ghosts that would not let him rest. Every mistake, no matter how small, became another piece of evidence that he was unworthy, another reason to hide his true self from the world. He judged himself mercilessly, and as is so often the case, that judgment spilled outward. His children felt it most of all. He demanded from them the perfection he could not achieve himself. He scolded them with the same severity he used on his own heart. The house was filled with a quiet fear, not because he lacked love, but because he did not know how to give it without condition. Then came the slow work of integration. At first, it felt unbearable to look at the shame he had carried for so long. But with time, he began to see that his failures did not make him less human. They made him fully human. He began to treat himself with a measure of understanding, and as he did, something shifted. He noticed that when his children made mistakes, he no longer rushed to scold them with harshness. He saw himself reflected in their faltering, and instead of anger, he felt compassion. He spoke with patience. he guided without shaming, and little by little a new language entered the home, the language of compassion. The man had not only freed himself, he had freed those around him. This is the paradox of healing. The more you forgive yourself, the greater your capacity to forgive others. Compassion is contagious. Once it begins within, it naturally extends outward, for you cannot taste the relief of mercy without wanting to offer it to others. And just as self-condemnation radiates into relationships, so too does self-acceptance. When you no longer carry the burden of shame, you do not impose it on those around you. When you learn to sit with your own imperfections, you become more patient with the imperfections of others. The anger that once erupted in judgment softens into understanding. The coldness that once kept others at a distance warms into presence. This is not something that can be forced. It flows naturally from the inner work of integration. Compassion for the self is not indulgence, nor is it weakness. It is strength of the highest order, for it requires courage to face the parts of yourself you once rejected and to say, "You belong." It requires honesty to admit that you are fallible, and humility to accept that fallibility as part of being alive. From this honesty and humility arises a love that is not dependent on achievement, but rooted in being. And from that love arises empathy, the ability to feel into the lives of others because you have finally allowed yourself to feel into your own. Consider how communities transform when compassion is present. In a family where self-criticism reigns, each person guards themselves, afraid of making mistakes, afraid of judgment. But in a family where compassion has been cultivated, mistakes are not catastrophes. They are opportunities for learning. In such a place, children grow not in fear, but in trust. Partners can speak openly without hiding their flaws. Friends can support one another without competing for worth. Compassion dissolves the walls that separate us, for it is the language of connection. Empathy binds communities together because it reminds us of our shared humanity. When you have made peace with your own shadows, you are less likely to condemn others for theirs. You recognize that everyone carries wounds, that everyone struggles in unseen ways. This recognition does not make you blind to harm or injustice, but it equips you to respond in ways that heal rather than divide. You can set boundaries without hatred, hold others accountable without cruelty, and extend forgiveness without losing your dignity. Compassion does not erase strength. It deepens it, for it roots strength in love rather than fear. And perhaps most powerfully, compassion allows you to belong to yourself. For without compassion, you remain at odds with your own heart, forever striving, forever failing in your own eyes. But with compassion, you can finally rest in the truth that you are enough as you are, even as you continue to grow. This rest is not stagnation. It is the fertile ground in which authentic growth becomes possible. For growth fueled by shame is fragile and false, but growth fueled by compassion is enduring and real. So, when you find yourself speaking with kindness to your own heart, when you notice that the harsh critic has been replaced by a patient guide, when you see that your tenderness toward yourself naturally spills over into tenderness toward others, take it as a sign. Integration is at work within you. The cycle of judgment has been broken, and in its place a new cycle begins, the cycle of compassion. And in that cycle lies not only your healing, but the healing of every relationship you touch. There is a point on the path of integration when the work of healing, which for so long has seemed to turn inward, begins to move outward. Up to this point, so much of the journey has been about gathering the fragments of the self, listening to the shadows, softening the judgments, untangling the knots of old pain. It has been about reclaiming what was lost, about building a home within where all parts of you may belong. But when the house of the self has been rebuilt, when you can rest within your own being without exile or division, something extraordinary begins to stir. It is the sense that your life is no longer meant to remain folded inward, but that your wholeness is being called beyond the boundaries of your own skin. This is the final sign of integration, the call toward wholeness beyond the self. At first, it may feel like a whisper, a subtle longing, not yet clear in form, but undeniable in presence. You notice that survival no longer feels like enough. The daily effort to get through, to protect, to simply endure was once all-consuming, but now it feels too small for the breadth of your spirit. You begin to ask a new question, one that does not come from fear or lack, but from abundance. How can what I have found within myself contribute to the life around me? This question is the mark of healing, for it arises not from emptiness but from fullness. When you are fractured, all your energy is spent holding yourself together, but when you are integrated, your wholeness naturally seeks to flow outward, to touch, to serve, to create. The ways this longing manifests are countless, and they are as individual as each life. For one person, it may take the form of mentoring the young, offering them guidance born of struggles once endured. For another, it may be the care of the earth, a desire to preserve and protect the beauty of a world that once brought them solace. For yet another, it may be art, the shaping of words, colors, or music into vessels of truth that speak to others who have yet to find their voice. And sometimes it appears in the simplest of ways, through presence alone, the willingness to sit with another in their pain, not to fix or to rescue, but to be a steady witness to their humanity. The form does not matter. What matters is the shift itself, the movement from survival to meaning, from isolation to connection, from self-concern to contribution. This movement is not forced. It cannot be willed into being as a moral duty, nor should it be confused with self-sacrifice born of guilt or obligation. It is not about neglecting yourself to serve others. It is the natural overflow of integration. When you are whole within, you are no longer ruled by scarcity. You no longer act out of desperation for approval or fear of rejection. Instead, you act out of abundance, because what you have cultivated inside is too rich to remain contained. Just as a tree, once rooted deeply, begins to bear fruit not for itself, but for the life around it, so too does the integrated self begin to give. Many spiritual traditions have spoken of this shift. They tell us that the self gathered in wholeness becomes strong enough to reach beyond itself, to touch the larger fabric of life. This does not mean the disappearance of individuality, but its flowering into something greater. The self becomes a vessel through which life itself flows more freely. The mystics call this service. Others may call it love, or contribution, or legacy. Whatever name we give it, the essence is the same. When you are healed enough to carry your own being with steadiness, you are freed to extend that steadiness outward. There is a story I once heard of a woman who spent years bound by her own suffering. She carried traumas that had fractured her sense of worth, and for a long time she withdrew from others, convinced she had nothing to give. But as she walked the slow path of integration, she began to reclaim her voice, her dignity, her sense of belonging. And with that reclamation came a new desire, not only to live for herself, but to accompany others on their path. She became a mentor to young women who struggled with the same wounds she once bore. Her wholeness became a lantern, illuminating the road for those still walking in the dark. In serving them, she discovered that her healing was not only personal but communal, a thread woven into the larger tapestry of life. This is perhaps the deepest paradox of the journey. What begins as an act of self, healing becomes an act of service. In turning inward to gather the fragments of the soul, you emerge with gifts for the world. The pain you have endured, the shadows you have faced, the compassion you have cultivated, all of it becomes medicine, not only for you but for others. Your story, once a source of shame, becomes a source of connection. Your wounds, once a mark of brokenness, become the very places from which healing radiates outward. When this call toward wholeness beyond the self arises, it brings with it a new sense of meaning. Life is no longer reduced to cycles of survival, nor is it bound by the pursuit of personal success alone. Instead, it becomes anchored in contribution, in the knowledge that your presence can make the world even slightly more whole. This meaning is not abstract. It is felt deeply in the body as a quiet satisfaction, a sense that you are aligned not only with yourself, but with the larger order of life. It gives resilience in the face of difficulty, for when your life is tied to something greater than yourself, suffering no longer feels empty. Even pain can become purposeful when it is in service of growth, connection, or love. What integration teaches us, finally, is that wholeness is not an end point, but a beginning. To become whole is not to reach perfection, or to withdraw into isolation, content only in your own peace. To become whole is to stand firmly enough within yourself that you can offer your strength to the whole of life. The healing that began as deeply personal opens outward into a healing that touches families, communities, even the earth itself. And though the forms may differ, the essence is the same. When the self is gathered, it cannot help but overflow. So, if you find within yourself this longing, not to fix the world, but to serve it in your own way, not to erase your individuality, but to let it shine in ways that nourish life, know that this is the sign of a soul healed enough to reach beyond itself. It is the sign that integration has done its work in you, and now invites you to take your place in the larger circle of being, where your wholeness becomes a gift not only to yourself but to all. Integration is not the end of struggle, but it is the beginning of freedom. It is the quiet confidence of knowing that all your parts belong, that your shadows and your light are not at war, but in conversation. If you recognize these signs, if you find yourself less afraid of your shadows, more coherent, less triggered, more compassionate, and drawn toward wholeness, then take heart, you are healing, and remember, the journey of integration is not about becoming someone else. It is about remembering who you truly are, and allowing that self to step into the light of wholeness.